shortly after the Dieselgate debacle of 2015, in which Volkswagen and other automakers were found to be intentionally cheating on emissions tests, building cars that not only lowered their emissions automatically when tested on a rolling road, but then emitted many, many times legal NOx and CO2 limits on the road, Volkswagen started a corporate rebranding. Gone was the age of the laughably named clean diesel vehicles, of the mini-me Darth Vader TV ads and tepid response to electric vehicles. And in its place, a promise that Volkswagen would become if not the world leader in electric vehicles. At the time, many of us laughed. While Volkswagen had been making electric vehicles in small prototype runs in the 1970s and 80s, I used to own an incredibly rare, one of three made right-hand drive 1985 Volkswagen Golf City Stromers, and at the time had started production of both the Volkswagen e-Golf and e-Up electric cars, not to mention the Volkswagen Golf GTE plug-in hybrid. None of its offerings to date were a particularly compelling drive. Sure, the limited production, so expensive Volkswagen XL1 diesel plug-in hybrid was certainly futuristic and proof that Volkswagen engineers were capable of breaking the mold, but nothing Volkswagen made at the time with a plug seemed like it was market leading. Then Volkswagen got super serious. While its sister brands Audi and Porsche pushed forwards with high-ticket expensive cars like the Audi e-tron and the bench-setting Porsche Taycan, a car that I still maintain to this day is the best car when it comes to driving. Volkswagen focused on vehicles that would harken back to the days of the Volkswagen Beetle. Fun, functional and affordable cars that everyone would want to drive. The result was the Volkswagen MEB platform, which roughly translates to the Modular Electric Drive Toolkit platform, built to accommodate a variety of different chassis configurations and capable of offering rear-wheel drive or all-wheel drive. The MEB platform gives Volkswagen a mass-market vehicle platform on which a variety of different sizes and shapes of vehicle can be built. It's the platform that underpins Volkswagen's first long-distance electric car, the Volkswagen ID.3, and it underpins a number of vehicles from Skoda, Seat and Audi. Sadly, the ID.3 isn't available in the United States, nor are Skoda or Seat cars, but this, the ID.4, Volkswagen's all-electric compact crossover, is, and it's based on the MEB platform too. At launch, Volkswagen said that this was a car for the millions, not millionaires, a car that carries through its legendary build quality and predictability, a car that's practical and gets the job done, just with an electric drivetrain. So today I'm going to tell you a little about this car. I'm going to show you around the car and discuss some of its quirks and features. And then I'm going to take it out on the road and then I'll give it a Doug. No, wait. I'm going to tell you if this meets its expectations or comes up short. Sorry, Doug. Got a little carried away there. Outside the ID.4, there's nothing that particularly stands out, at least in the daytime. The exterior isn't exciting per se, and it's not going to win any awards for standing out from the pack. Inoffensive might be a great way of describing it, while correctly proportioned would probably be a nicer way of putting it. At night time, the ID.4 First has illuminated handles that look pretty stunning, as well as a little projected O that shines on the ground in front of the driver and front passenger doors. That's a nice touch, but an extra thing to go wrong with the car. On that front, however, it is nice to see traditional door handles used here rather than retractable ones, which I've heard so many horror stories about from other cars from other brands that use them, and I'm not going there. Sadly, there is no front trunk, which is a big disappointment. Open the bonnet and you'll see power electronics instead. This is a shame given the fact that the ID.4 First is a rear-wheel drive car, but the lack of drivetrain up front does mean that it has a really decent turning circle, far better than any other EV I've driven of late at 33.5 feet or 10.2 meters. That's not quite London taxi, but not far off, and believe me, it's extremely useful. Oh, and the tailgate is electrically assisted as well, which is becoming standard on most cars in this price point. Technically, the ID.4 is classified as a compact crossover SUV, but when we were filming the B-roll for this review, one of my colleagues noted that it looks almost as big as a Tesla Model X when the two are side by side on the road. That is, however, mostly an optical illusion because by the numbers, they show that the ID.4 is slightly narrower, slightly shorter and a tad taller than a Tesla Model Y. But suffice to say, it feels more mid-size than compact. Luckily for families, this means plenty of interior space. There's a lot of space for front and rear seat passengers, and I don't see there being a problem by accommodating 5 seats on long-distance family trips. The only bugbear that there is unlike most electric cars on sale today, the ID.4's rear floor isn't completely flat. There's a small hump in the middle where the middle seat passenger would put their feet, so bear that in mind before offering your taller friends a ride back there. Cargo-wise, there's bucket loads of room, including a false floor where you can stow the included granny lead charging connector. On paper, there's just over 33 cubic feet, 858 litres of trunk space with the seats up, more than enough for all the camera gear we used when filming this review. Something we can't say of every car we review, or indeed my own daily driver. And if you fold the rear seats flat, you can expand that cargo capacity to 64 and a bit cubic feet, or 1,817 litres. There's also this nifty little pass-through door that I think all cars should have, meaning that you can carry long, thin items without forcing your rear seat passengers to become best buddies, perform weird contortions, or get an Uber instead. I should also note the towing capabilities of this car, because unlike some EVs on the market, it is approved to tow. You can tow up to 2,200 pounds, which is 998 kilograms, with a braked trailer in the US, although towing limits may be different elsewhere in the world, so you might want to check that. And that's really useful for towing anything from small gardening trailers to pop-up campers or sport trailers. And in fact, I got to test out the towing capabilities of this car this week when I helped out our animator and production assistant Erin move house. With that, let's get out of the wind and look inside. When I first stepped behind the wheel of the ID.4, I was hit with what felt like an attempt to be like Tesla. Minimal, clean, and with keyless ignition. And while there is a start-stop switch hidden behind the steering wheel, this car does behave like a Tesla. If you've got the key and you step behind the wheel, putting your foot on the brake is enough to turn the car on and make it ready to drive. There's also this neat little light bar underneath the front window that Volkswagen likes to call the ID light. It pulses when you turn the car on, it flashes if you need to brake suddenly, and it also turns into the state of charge indication when it's charging, which I'll admit is a really nice touch. Aside from this, the interior of the ID.4 also reminds me a lot of the BMW i3, and that's probably because it's got an almost identical dashboard layout with a floating display in the centre and a gear selector sitting behind the wheel on this little protrusion next to the dash. I'm not a fan of it, but at least it does open up the centre console area for extra cup holders. There are 4, plus 2 spaces in the door for bottles. And if you're someone who doesn't want to stop for drinks in COVID world, that's great news. Alternatively, you can unclip the front holder here to open up the space for whatever it is you can fill in there. I've been trying to figure out what exactly would fit, but frankly, I'm drawing a blank. The display is easy to read and clear and within reach, but it's also extremely slow to respond to touch. That's extremely disappointing and really frustrating. We had a moment during our B-roll filming this week when the car refused to allow me to talk to someone using hands-free, and even after rebooting both the car and the phone, we got nothing. Talking of phones, wireless CarPlay and Android Auto are both standard, and there's this little neat space underneath the front cup holders where you can charge your phone wirelessly using the Qi standard. I found a USB cable actually provides more power to my aging iPhone X, but that's just personal preference. You've got 2 USB-C connectors up front and 2 in the rear, plus rear vents. And with dual zone climate control, you can have a passenger that likes things hot and spicy when you prefer cool and chill. To activate climate control, you've got several different options. You can use the car's natural voice system called Hello ID to tell the car you're cold or hot, or you can hit the button called Climber. That's right, Volkswagen couldn't figure out how to complete the word while keeping it readable, so they just lopped off the last 2 letters. It brings up a smart climate control screen where you can tell the ID.4 to heat or cool different parts of the cabin. Or if you're feeling old-fashioned, you can go to a classic climate switch that allows you to control the temperature. To directly change the temperature of the air blowing in your general direction, front seat passenger and driver have a red and a blue button. Touch them and the obvious happens. But the red herring, when you're driving along, there's an icon right here, and it looks like the seater heat icon. But It's not. It just takes you to the climber screen, just like the climber button does. And from there you have to activate the heated seats as you would normally like to, or activate the heated steering wheel, which doesn't have any easy way of turning itself on or off from the wheel. Which brings me to the final thing that's worthy of note in the ID.4's interior: the capacitive buttons everywhere. Even the shade moonroof is touch and press, and if you touch it, it takes a literal age to close. Usually cars will have a combination of physical switches and touchscreen software buttons, and well, that works, but the ID.4's touch-sensitive capacitive buttons have haptic feedback, which is a fancy way of saying they vibrate when you touch them. You will either love them or hate them. Only the front window switches, the gear selector, windscreen wipers and light controls are traditional switched affairs. And of course, the pedals are traditional as well, although in the ID.4 First they have play and pause motifs, in case you're not sure what they do. No review would be complete without discussing charging, and as I've already said, the Volkswagen ID.4 comes with 11 kilowatt onboard charging, which means you can use an AC charging station at home that's capable of providing up to and including 11 kilowatts. If you have an 11 kilowatt capable charging station at home, this means the ID.4 can charge from empty to full in around 7.5 hours. The other advantage for the ID.4, of course, is its DC quick charging capability, which isn't the fastest that we've seen on the marketplace by a long shot. However, this version of the ID.4, the First edition, which has the 77 kilowatt hour battery pack, can charge at up to 125 kilowatts. Of course, if you've been around in the EV space for any length of time, you'll know that that number is pretty meaningless, because it literally means the maximum power that it can dump into the battery pack. And as usual with any electric car, the fuller the battery pack becomes, the slower the rate of charge, because physics. We plugged in, and I think we probably had about 14% on the battery when we plugged in. I did briefly see 129 kilowatts from this Electrify America charging station. If you take into consideration any losses in the system, that is about 125 kilowatts flat out charging. Now the car is more close to 75% full, and I'm still seeing a charge rate of around 65 kilowatts. We've actually recorded a video of the charging taking place, so hopefully you'll see how the charge rate ramps down as the battery pack gets full. I should also point out that the battery pack was left overnight in a semi-charged state, so that we would be able to drain it as much as possible when we arrived here. This was actually our second charging stop, because the first one that we arrived at was occupied, which is great news because it means that people are using electric cars, but it did mean that we had a little bit further to travel on surface streets to get here to charge. So I'm assuming that the battery was fairly cool when we plugged in, and we were still able to achieve that high rate of charge. I can tell you, standing here right next to the bonnet, there's a lot of heat coming out from underneath the bonnet where all of the power electronics are. So the car is working really hard to keep that battery pack cool. Let's talk about the different driving modes that the ID.4 has. You can access them by pressing the mode button, which is underneath the touchscreen display, and then you get a choice of Eco, which is obviously the most efficient. You get the most regenerative braking on accelerator liftoff, but you don't get single pedal driving in this car. No matter what you do, you get close to it in eco mode with B engaged, but that really is the limit. After that, you get comfort mode, which is my least favorite mode of all the driving modes in the ID.4. In this mode, everything feels a bit wafty. The car is very indirect in its steering response. The steering is extremely light, and it feels, frankly, like you have to work extremely hard to get the car to do anything that's moderately exciting. I mean, it really is the most boring mode of all the modes in the ID.4. Next, you get the sport mode, and when you engage sport mode, it remaps the accelerator. It gives you more instant access to the power that's available from that 201 horsepower motor. It tightens up the steering significantly, and it feels a lot more pleasurable to drive on this twisty road. I've driven this road several times while we've been filming this review. We've done a lot of chase car footage here, and frankly, this is the best way to experience this road, especially these twisties that we're coming up to here. You can probably hear everything sliding around in the back of the car. That's just some camera gear. Don't worry about that. That's nothing in the car. And in this mode, the ID.4 does come to life. You're still having to use the brake pedal to slow down for corners, and yes, there's still understeer because this is a rear-wheel drive car, and there is no way that this feels particularly planted in any way, shape or form. But it is moderately good fun driving the car in this mode around these tight, twisty bends. Unfortunately though, the seat is not particularly good at holding you in position. So if you are driving roads like this, be prepared to be flung about in the cabin, because the ID.4 doesn't have a particularly ergonomically designed seat. Sure, it's comfortable, but it's not designed for sporty, engaged driving. And as such, I find myself sliding around quite considerably every time I put my foot to the floor. To be frank, sport mode is what I would expect most electric cars to deliver in their normal default mode of operation. And it's kind of disappointing that Volkswagen considers this its sport mode. Even with sport mode engaged, however, this is not going to be an engaging ride. The ID.4 has an 8+ second sprint time, and even in sport mode, with the steering firmed up and the accelerator response remapped, it's still a big heavy car, and you feel the weight in every single corner on a mountain pass like this. That means that you're not going to be driving this car along a mountain pass for the sheer thrill of driving a car quickly along a mountain road. And I know some people watching this wouldn't do that. I know others live for moments like that. I do. I like the thrill of winding the car around every corner, of feeling that the car is perfectly balanced and doing everything that I want it to. In sport mode, I get just the hint that the car maybe might one day have a sportier personality, and maybe we'll see that in the GTX variant. But honestly, this is still dull, which is why I like to call the three modes that this car has: dull, boring, and accounting 101. But let's be honest, this car is a family SUV. It's not a sports car. It's not built for winding through mountain passes like this. And if you are someone who has a family, the chances are you're going to be going along a mountain road when there's lots of other people doing it too, which means you're going to be stuck behind other people, gaping at the scenery at 25 miles an hour. And in that situation, the ID.4 is going to be perfectly at home. It's very well behaved. It's not going to do anything weird. And the steering is predictable. And the power delivery is predictable. And after that, well, that's pretty much it. There goes our camera guy. I don't think he saw me. Talking about sightseeing though, this car is going to be great for doing that, because there's very few blind spots in the ID.4. In fact, the visibility of this car is pretty good for a vehicle this size and this new. The A-pillars, while fairly hefty for obvious safety reasons, they've got all of the airbag gubbins hiding in them, they're still pretty easily seen past, and it's not in a position that would cause you problems when you're pulling out from a difficult junction. Similarly, there's plenty of glass in the cabin, and none of the pillars are particularly huge. Even the C-pillars at the back are small enough that there's not really a massive blind spot to worry about. So I'm going to give Volkswagen 10 out of 10 for visibility. While the ID.4's seats are not designed for sporty handling, and in fact, if you even dare to use sport mode in anything approaching a sporty fashion, you will get flung around the interior because the seats do not grip your backside, I think they'd be reasonably comfortable to sit in for the 260 or 418 kilometers that this car can drive between charges. That's the EPA approved figure, by the way, and even though I was driving the car on the motorway at points, it still met its EPA range or exceeded it, which suggests, as we live in the Pacific Northwest and there are lots of hills, that if you live somewhere flat, you might be able to really get even further per charge without any hard work on your part at all. Some of the bugbears that I've got about this car have been really irking me all week. First up, these capacitive buttons, which it's so easy to knock, especially if you're not someone who holds the steering wheel at 10 and 2. They literally activate on contact with human skin. So you can brush it with your hand and you've suddenly changed the radio station or changed the cruise control or activated something that you're not really sure of how to turn it off. And that can be extremely frustrating. The other frustration is the windows. They also operate using this silly capacitive touchscreen system. And that means if you want to activate the rear windows, you have to touch the rear button switch, which is capacitive, and then use the same switches that exist for the front windows. And that's just clunky. It feels like bad user interface design, and I really don't like it. I've already told you what I think of the ID.4's range capabilities. I believe it really can meet its EPA approved range. And it gets that range from a 77 kilowatt hour lithium ion battery pack. That is one of the reasons why this car is so heavy. It's over 1,000 pounds, nearly 500 kilos heavier than my Chevrolet Bolt EV, but sadly it doesn't have much more in terms of power. The motor in the ID.4 is essentially the same. My Chevrolet Bolt EV has a 200 horsepower motor. The ID.4 has a 201 horsepower motor, which is about 149 kilowatts, in case you're interested. It has less torque than my Chevrolet Bolt EV, and that's one of the reasons why this car has an 8+ second sprint time, which frankly will feel agonizingly slow to anyone who's driven an electric car before. But we have to remember that the ID.4 is designed as a family SUV. It is not a sports car, and it reminds you that at every single turn. For that reason, I don't think we should harp on too much about the performance capabilities of the ID.4. And of course, Volkswagen is bringing the GTX variant to market soon, which will have better figures. So let's focus on something that might be a bit more tangible if you want the ID.4 as a family car, namely the interior comfort, how it feels on the road. As I've already noted, the ID.4 seats are not the best when it comes to sporty driving, but on a freeway like this, they are incredibly comfortable. They soak up plenty of the bumps, and both the front passenger and the driver's seat are fully electronically adjustable with lumbar support and memory presets, which means it's really easy to find that perfect setting for you and then recall it at the touch of a button. Because of that great visibility, it's very easy to see what's going on around the car. The wing mirrors are nice and large, and the car has blind spot warning detection, which lets you know if there's somebody in your blind spot to avoid you crashing into them. Now, I will note, I live in a rural part of Oregon, and I just live on a regular 2-lane road. That's 1 lane for each direction. And shortly after I got the ID.4 and I was driving it down that road, the car was freaking out every time I went past a tree on the other side of the road. It kept flashing the warning system to tell me that there was someone in my blind spot. To be honest, that was a little distracting, and I've got used to it now, but that might be something to bear in mind if you live and you have to drive along small country lanes. While we're on the subject of assistive technologies, let's talk about the radar assisted cruise control and the lane keep assist. The radar assisted cruise control is very good, it's very responsive, and it keeps you a set distance from the car in front. The lane keep assist is less so. It's one of those lane keep assist systems that, if you're not really paying attention, means your car bounces from side to side of the lane like a pinball. And that tells me that this lane keep assist is really not intended to help you place yourself in the center of the lane, but rather to make sure that you don't absent-mindedly drift into the lane next to you, or when you want to change lanes, you have forgotten to indicate, and then the system will warn you and tell you, hey, you're drifting across the lanes. To add to that, when I'm driving on country lanes, I found the assistive systems trying to take over the steering of the car, and sometimes not getting it right. On a tight corner, for example, the car sometimes tries to tuck in too tightly or goes a little wide. And while this is a rear-wheel drive car, and yes, it does understeer terribly if you're pushing it too hard, I really wish that that assistive system didn't activate on single lane roads, because honestly, there are a multitude of reasons why you're not always in the correct lane positioning on a country road, be it a massive pothole in the ground that could damage the suspension, a creature that's on the side of the road that you don't want to run over because somebody else has already done it, or some other reason not to be in your perfect lane position. And I think it would be helpful if the car knew that and reacted to it. Since the ID.4 is designed primarily as a family SUV, I should probably comment on the sound attenuation inside the cabin, because obviously a quiet car is more preferable if you have young children who you would prefer to be asleep in the back while you're on a long distance family trip. I measured the ID.4 on a variety of different roads this week, and the noisiest the cabin got was 100 decibels, so 105 when I was really pushing it on a bad section of freeway that had poor surface material. And at that point, the 20-inch wheels of this car do amplify the noise in the cabin. But 105 decibels as the maximum volume inside the car, that's a lot better than other cars I've driven in recent years, and it should be enough if you add in that electric drivetrain to mean that babies should remain sleeping. And that means no crying babies. And that means your long distance family road trip is a whole lot more pleasant. I'm coming back into Portland after doing my country road driving, and I thought I'd just take a look at the efficiency and how well I've been driving it since I unplugged it at my house this morning. We've done 76 miles since it was fully charged, and the gasometer on the car still says it's got 200 miles of range remaining. Bear in mind, about 50% of that has been country roads and about 50% has been freeway roads at freeway speeds. Although I should note that the country roads did involve some significant hill climbing, because I live on a hill, and also we were filming up in the hills east of Portland while we were doing the country road segment. As I noted in my recent review of the Ford Mustang Mach-E, you can see it here if you haven't watched it yet, there are some cars that I get on review that I could imagine myself owning at some point in the future. Then there are the cars that I cannot wait to give back because they just are not all that fun or pleasant to drive. And then there are the cars that have to be pried out of my cold dead hands. The Mach-E was one such vehicle, but the Volkswagen ID.4 isn't. It's a car that I'm quite happily going to give back the keys and say, thank you for a fun week, and get on with the rest of my life. It's a perfectly functional car. It gets the job done. It rides reasonably quietly at high speed. It behaves well in town, and the onboard tech is okay. Sure, I despise the capacitive touchscreens, and the interface could use some work to make it more intuitive. Climate control should not be 2 button presses away, nor should opening the rear windows. But it gets the job done. Its range predictions are accurate, and I have no doubt that the 260 miles or more is achievable in real-world conditions. It can charge at up to 125 kilowatts at DC quick charging stations, although it loses points for not having plug and charge connectivity, which is something I think should now be standard on every new EV. And it can tow. And that in of itself is a big bonus if anyone wants a family-friendly EV. And for a family, there's a lot to like about the ID.4. Its interior is spacious, there's decent luggage carrying capabilities, and the interior looks like it will stand up to some serious abuse. Although the white wheel is not one, but you can get that in black if you prefer. Despite these compliments though, I just can't find any passion for this car. Maybe it's the uninspiring, slightly unconnected feeling behind the wheel, the slightly wafty experience when I tuck it into a corner, even in sport mode. Or the fact that despite having nearly 1,000 pounds on my daily drive at a Chevrolet Bolt hatchback, this car has 1 extra horsepower and far less torque. It's only enjoyable in sport mode, and even then it's only a passable drive. The Volkswagen ID.4 is a competent vehicle. It delivers the basics you'd expect for a family SUV. It's competent and it's perfunctory. If the Porsche Taycan is the one uncle you have who's 55, looks 35, has a plane license and does Ironmans at the weekend for fun, then this is your 55-year-old uncle who looks 65, likes to have his taxes done every year on January 1st, and can spend 2 hours telling you the difference between a Roth IRA and a 401k and why you need both for a rounded portfolio of investments. Don't get me wrong, both uncles are valid. They're worth having in your life, and it's important to save for your retirement. But one of the many reasons I got into electric cars was the thrill of driving them, the instant torque, the quick acceleration, and the knowledge that if I needed instant extra power, it's a squeeze of the throttle away. The ID.4 doesn't give me that. Its responses feel pedestrian, and the weight, you feel it. And for a car that in this trim costs nearly $44,000 US, well, I kind of want more for that money. Sure, there is the ID.4 GTX, the recently announced all-wheel drive 299 horsepower, 223 kilowatt performance variant. It has a 6.2 second sprint time, and it promises to be more spirited. But it's only going to be available in some markets around the world, and North America isn't one of them. In short then, if you're looking for an engaging electric SUV, give the ID.4 a pass. Maybe buy a Mustang Mach-E or a Tesla Model Y. But if you want an electric family SUV, you want a Volkswagen, well then the ID.4 is okay. At nearly $40,000 US equivalent, it is a hefty spend, but it will take you, your kids and your trailer and both your uncles to the coast for the weekend. That is, of course, if you can endure another lecture on fiduciary responsibilities. That's it for today. As always, thanks to the folks on my right for being our $15 to $49 a month Patreon supporters. Special thanks to our $50 a month patrons. That's Anonymous Freak, Regine Fellows, Gordon C, Paul Conway, Laura Sanborn, Anthony Coates, Denny Hyde, Sean Ueda, and Tazla in the Gong. And our deepest gratitude to our $100 a month Patreon supporters. It's John Lyons, Marcel Ward, Reggie Watts, JP Fagerback, Will Graylin, and Ian. If you'd like to join the ranks of wonderful Patreon supporters, you'll find a link below to Patreon as well as Bitcoin and Ko-fi. You can chat with TE fans over at Discord, and if you'd like to buy some TE swag, just head over to our Redbubble store. Thanks for joining me, and as always, keep evolving.